What is this thing called ether? And one of the champions of ether was Nikola Tesla. Some of you, at least several of you, must have heard his name one time or another. And here it is. He said the following about the ether, right? He said, all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance. Substance? Beyond conception. I like that. He says, it's a substance, but I cannot even conceive it beyond my ability to visualize it, right? Filling all of space, the luminiferous ether. Okay, so he was a proponent of the ether. And, you know, a lot of these people, they follow him, they consider him a hero, etc., partly because he bucked the trend against the establishment. And so he's a hero for several reasons. Also, he was an electrician, a guy who worked electricity and worked with gadgets and invented stuff. So in many ways, he's a hero to these individuals. And the first comment I got to say there is that a person who works with technology is not a scientist. A technologist, an inventor, someone who invents devices, someone who fixes devices mechanically or electrically is not a scientist. A scientist is one and one only, and that is the person who explains. Science, we only do one thing, that's explain. Okay, and we do so rationally. And so if a guy invents a gadget and he puts it and makes money and it works and is he a scientist? No, he may not even know why it works the way it was. The way it does. And that was the case specifically with Tesla. Tesla invented gadgets. He had no idea what electricity is. He had no idea what light is. He had no idea what any of these things are. And here's proof, evidence. I always like to introduce proof and evidence to convince people, to persuade them. And here it is. Nick said the following: if you wish to understand the universe, think of what? Energy and vibrations. What? Energy? What's energy? What does energy have anything to do with physics? Physically, we don't use the word energy. You know, whenever someone talks about energy, he's not talking about physics. He's talking about some kind of math. And vibration of what? Well, I guess he was referring to the ether, vibrations of ether, disturbances, as some of these people call them. So all these people, all these etherists, they use these terms. And they think they're making sense. They think they're getting their message across when they're absolutely not. And I like the fact that, he worked for Edison, who eventually founded General Electric company. And Edison wasn't a scientist either. He's regarded, they call him the Wizard of Menlo Park because he did wizard, like Mr. Wizard, he did a lot of tricks out there. But the problem with Edison, he was not a scientist. He was not a scientist. I don't even think he was a technologist. He had people like Tesla who worked for him during a period, I think, like 6 months, and then went to work for the competition for Westinghouse. But, Edison famously said, I have not failed. I've found 10,000 ways that won't work. And it wasn't him. It was his people who did all that work. He didn't do, he was the manager. He was just the guy who paid the salaries. That's it. And Nick Tesla apparently, knew him well or to some degree, and he probably shook his head many times with Edison. And he said, if Edison had to find a needle in a haystack, he would start by pulling one straw at a time until he found the needle. And that's more or less what Edison is saying there. Yeah, neither one of these two were scientists, and people confuse them as for scientists because they did inventions and they have their name in lights. But these people were not scientists. They had no idea what electricity is. They died without knowing what electricity is. Okay, so no, these are not scientists. Scientists, a person who can tell you, who can explain to you a mechanism. Okay, out there, especially. Gravity, electricity, light, the workings of the atom, magnetism, things of that nature. Those are the ones that no one has ever been able to explain. Those are the ones people want to understand. People want to know, why does this thing fall to the floor? That's the question people want to understand. They say, look, I just want to know why it always falls to the floor. It never falls to the ceiling. And very simple question. Not a single scientist or mathematical physicist or even the dissenting ones, none of them can answer that question. Not in a rational manner. In order to do so, you need to identify the objects that are in contact with the pencil or pen or spoon or whatever fell to the floor, And unless you can identify those invisible, intangible mediators, you will not have an explanation. Okay, so what are the aetherist arguments that they brought last couple weeks? So I put a couple of them here. And I'm saying that debating an ether is just a waste of time. These people don't understand that you need to define what a thing is. And once you define it, you have to point to the thing that you're going to use to do your physical interpretation. You can't do physics, a mechanism, without a thing. You need a thing there. You need to show it. You should be able to make a movie of your theory in physics when you give a physical interpretation. What are you going to put on the screen for ether? And this is where we run into trouble because right off the bat, because one fellow tells me, or a couple of them told me, ether is not an object, it's not a thing. Okay? So what is it? And they say, well, ether is a medium, a substance. It turns out that the word medium, the word substance, the word object, the word thing mean all exactly the same thing in physics. Okay, so there is no difference between those words. So you can't say it's a thing, but it's not a thing. That's all you're saying when you're saying it's a medium, but it's not an object. That's all you're saying. Okay, because an object, a medium, are synonym, perfect synonyms in physics. Okay, and so yeah, we have a problem there. And so these people don't want to draw, don't want to illustrate, point to an illustration somewhere on the internet, or upload one. So say this is the ether, Bill. They can't do that. And they won't do that because it destroys their religion. So they try to stay away from that as much as they can. And so here one fellow tells me, says, there will never be a picture of ether because it has no Cartesian. You what? A Cartesian? What is he saying? He's saying, look, it has no location. I can't put a couple of what they call coordinates. Right? Really, they're not talking about coordinates. They're talking about number lines, something that our good old friend René Descartes never realized, that he wasn't talking about coordinates or dimensions or vectors for that matter of physics. He was talking about number lines. And these number lines, he said, you need two number lines, in ordered set to locate the ether. He says you can't do that. But what you can do is locate disturbances within the ether. Like, if there's something in there, then you can locate it with respect to, I don't know what, I guess not with respect to the edges of the ether, because they tell you that the ether has no edges because there's nothing outside of the ether. So the ether is everything, everything's that exists or that is there that they're going to work with is inside the ether. And the question is whether the ether is made out of the gazillions of particles you see there, or is made out of a single piece. And that's another question that we have to look at. But anyways, this fellow has excused himself saying, look, it has no Cartesian. You can't locate the ether from outside or whatever. Okay, so it's a bad starting point because, the first thing they tell you is they cannot illustrate the ether. And so, if they're going to explain a mechanism, what are they going to explain if they haven't put anything on the board? If you put a tree, you can say, look, the tree shook like this and the coconut fell, and you can explain something. But when you say, look, I can't even illustrate the ether because it's not a thing, but let me explain to you the mechanism, well, we're in for a long dissertation there, for sure. Okay, so when I asked them to define it, they say, oh, you're playing word games, Bill. You're doing semantics, okay? And one fellow says the ether is continuous, meaning it's made of a single piece, okay? And so he says there's nothing outside of it, or there's several of these. I may be gave from a couple of different guys, but these are the questions that or comments that these people make. And so here's the nothingness, and nothing outside of it. Okay, so you have to imagine that what you're seeing there as something that is infinite, because there's nothing outside of it. And the problem comes, when these people start fooling around with something on the inside of that, because they say it's made out of a single piece, it's continuous, right? And suddenly they start talking about this. They say, hey, a piece of the ether, a region of the ether does this and does that, and moves and vibrates and disturbs and who knows what else. They talk about vortices and waves and things inside the ether. And I thought they just told me that the ether is made out of a single piece, that it's continuous. Now, how did this thingy start moving within the ether if the ether is made out of a single piece? And again, we have this situation where these people don't illustrate the ether at all. It's everything. It extends forever. It's infinite, right? It's got to be infinite in order for it not to have shape. Nothing outside of it means it's infinite. So we have an infinite finite, because all objects are finite. That's an object is that which has shape. So we have an infinite finite. We already have a contradiction there. They say it's made out of a single piece, meaning continuous. There's no little pieces, parts inside it, because I tell them that the ether has always been a bunch of particles, all these little dots that form the background. They say, no, that's wrong. That's not it, Bill. It's made out of a single piece. It's clean. And then you start moving things inside the ether. And so we have problems. First, that they don't illustrate the ether. They tell you it's continuous, and then they start looking at little pieces within the ether. Okay, so we have a lot of irrationality already right there, and all that has to be clarified, and these people never do. So here you have one of these fellows, and he talks about what continuous means. He says, ether was never a bunch of particles. It was always conceived as a continuous medium, meaning something with no discrete parts. So I don't know what they're going to be moving. If you have a block universe, an infinite block universe made out of a single piece, I don't know how you can create any motion within that, because it's made out of a single piece. But this fellow says it's not made of particle. It says Gaede clings to an outdated Aristotelian idea that something continuous must be made of parts. No. I clarified to him, because he wasn't aware that Aristotle said, that continuous means something totally opposite to what he said. He said his notion is the physical notion of continuous, which is made of a single piece. That's why I told him you should use that phrase. You should not say continuous, because continuous means something else in the religion of mathematics. It means divisible. That's what continuous means. That's how Aristotle defined it. So he says, I'm clinging to those notions. I'm not clinging to anything. I'm just telling you what it means in the religion of math. Okay, and what it means in the religion of math is divisibility. It means you can chop it up in gazillion pieces. That's what continuous means according to Aristotle. In fact, it's what it means according to math, according to the so-called physicist, because he says something continuous must be made of parts. He says, which is not how modern physics defines it. Yes, that's how modern physics, meaning mathematics, right? That's exactly how they defined it. There is no such notion as continuous in physics, only in mathematical physics, which is only math. And here it is. Okay, let's look at that definition of what they think. Here's continuous. It's an adjective, okay? And they use this adjective to define motion. In other words, they're going to use it as an adverb, not as an adjective. But they call it an adjective because that's what it means in ordinary speech. And they bring it without any indiscriminately into physics. They just bring it in, this notion from ordinary speech, and just bring it into physics. An unbroken whole without interruption. We all understand that, right? But they're not talking about interruption of a physical object. They're not saying the table is continuous. That's not what they're saying. They're saying motion is uninterrupted. They're talking about incessant motion, not about interruption of, in other words, the table being cut in two. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about motion. That's why continuous should not be used, because everybody has a different notion of what continuous means. And then you see an example. It says the whole performance is enacted in one what? Continuous movement. No, it's not continuous movement. That's an irrational statement in physics. In ordinary speech, you can get away with that. But in physics, you cannot say continuous movement. You're talking about incessant movement, incessant motion. You cannot use the word continuous in that context there. That's only in ordinary speech. And this is where people get confused and bring it into physics. A series with no exception or reversals. Again, they're talking about continuous advances, right? And there you see another one, mathematics of a function, small variation of values. That's what they're talking about. They're talking value. How many values are there? Well, you look at the number line, you'll find gazillions of values, infinite values, right, as they call it. Continuum measurement, gradual transitions. Transitions of what? I thought it was made out of a single piece. Then they talk about the real line, numbers. What are numbers? A bunch of discrete, you could say, entities, right? Then your continuum ordered set of what? Of the real line. What's a line there? You see it at the bottom, the real number line. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about something which is chopped into pieces, right? The continuum topology, connected. What's connected? I thought it was made out of a single piece. What could be connected? And then you see continuum hypothesis and infinite set. That's what it is. So all these notions are from math. That's what they use in so-called physics, which ain't physics either, and all these are made of parts. Never has there been a notion of a physical notion of continuous, continuum, or any derivative of the word continuous. There has never been a notion, a physical notion. They've never had that. So this fellow doesn't even understand that. No, in physics, so-called mathematical physics, we need to distinguish real physics from the religion of mathematical physics. In the religion of mathematical physics, they use the word continuous or any derivative like they do in mathematics. And in there you saw the examples. They're all connected points, numbers, values, etc., etc., etc. There's no such thing as a physical entity which is made of a single piece. It never even dawned on the mathematicians. So no, in so-called physics, if you're talking about mathematical physics, they don't have that notion either. They still have the Aristotelian notion even to this day. Okay? In physics, continuous means smooth, unbroken, not made of particles. Absolutely not. That's not what it means in so-called physics, meaning mathematical physics. In real physics, yeah, but that's why you should not use the word continuous. You should use the phrase made of a single piece. Then it's very clear. It's either made of parts or made of a single piece, right? And he says that I know so little about actual physics, he's resorted to arguing over vocabulary. Yeah, I do a lot of semantics, word salad. And for them, it's just noise, a little bit of noise that enters their ear, and they say, just goes through the other side and says, what is he talking about? I came here to do physics, not grammar. Okay, so here we have 3 examples that I gave them. Descartes, Boyle, and Stokes. Robert Boyle and Stokes. What was his name? Can't remember Stokes' name now. George Stokes. And they specifically stated, because no one else in history hardly ever defined the ether. Everybody assumed it was a bunch of particles, but no one actually defined it. And so, people have these notions that, it was made out of a single piece, which was the notion that Aristotle had for the ether. That it was this thingy out there that was everything, and it was not made of parts. But then he used the word ether, which means air, which he acknowledged was made of parts, and he defined continuous as made of parts. So Aristotle had a contradiction he never resolved. Okay, so that's the issue. But the thing is that throughout history, it's been a bunch of particles. That's what all these people thought. And he wasn't aware of this because ether is the thing that an aetherist never does is read. He doesn't read history. He doesn't know, who Boyle was or who any of these guys are. So when you mention it to them, they start looking and say, oh, who is he talking about? For the first time they encounter these names. And the question again, what are we talking about? When they were looking at it in the 19th century, when we're talking about the Michelson-Morley experiment, for example, the series of experiments that they ran to determine whether there was an ether or not out there, what were they talking about? Well, they didn't define it. That's why Michelson and Morley should be kicked out of science, because before you do an experiment, you got to do a design of experiment. You got to know what you're going to try to prove. In this case, they were trying to prove whether there was an ether. They weren't trying to detect the ether. Okay, no problem. Make a design of experiment. Begin by telling us what is the ether that you're trying to prove or disprove. And they never did that. They never told you what the ether is. Everybody has this notion that the ether's just some substance out there. Some of them probably thought of it as a single piece. Others thought it was made out of gazillions of particles, like, Stokes and so on. And so, what are you trying to prove? First you have to define the ether. You have to tell us what the ether is. And so there were two notions, essentially, for those who proposed particles. And one was the sandbox, I call it, and the other one is the pool of water. Either the grains of sand were static, standing still, and the earth ran right through that sandbox, or the earth was moving through some kind of ocean, where all the particles were moving in different directions. And so the question, they had all these notions. They had the static notion of the ether, and they had the dynamic notion of ether. And the question is, which one were they trying to prove? Which one did they prove? And again, in the days of Einstein, as far back as 1920, he was already still talking about the ether. He was saying, you'll see his comment there when he talked at the University of Leiden, and he said, relativity without ether is unthinkable, unimaginable. So he still believed in the ether up to 1920, but he had another notion of the ether that Lorentz and some of these other fellows had. They had a different notion of the ether. Again, they never defined what the ether is. That's the problem. And so, the ether is a big problem primarily because no one's defined it. And when you have this fellow who comes over and says, I told him, take a snapshot of the ether and show me the ether. And he said, I can't because ether is always moving. Okay, so it's moving, and so what? He says, well, so it doesn't have shape because it's constantly on the move. And this is the notion all these people have. What they're saying is the following. They're saying, when I move, I don't have shape. Yeah, no kid, you lose your shape as soon as, so please, if you want to have shape, you got to stand still. But then they say, even your electrons are moving in every atom of your body. And so you take a snapshot and you say, okay, here's a snapshot of whatever, of a tree or a rock. I mean, that's as static as it gets. He said, oh, but the electrons in the snapshot are moving, the pixels and the atoms that make up the photograph. And so you have to stop all motion because these people are constantly on the move. They never stand still. And so, that's why I had to create the universal movie, okay? And the universal movie is a good tool to destroy anybody who talks about motion or time. We have to kill time. We have to kill all that vibration these people have in their brains. And so what we have is, that's God's film, okay? And he takes a snapshot, and nothing moves in that snapshot. You want to see motion of an electron, of a photon, or whatever. It doesn't matter. You need at least 2 frames in the movie. Okay? In a single frame, there's no motion whatsoever. It's a cross-section of location, cross-section of time, meaning it's distance, location, and existence only in that single frame. And once you point that out, now anything that's in that frame, you can identify. So if there's a tree there, you would see a tree. And if you see a rock, you would see a rock. Okay? Because nothing moves. That's God's film there. And in one frame of the film, there is no motion in God's film. And so you got to talk to them in those terms, see if maybe they can understand. Maybe. Okay? So this destroys their notion that electrons and photons and whatever are moving constantly. Not in that single frame. Okay? So if there's a photon there and it looks like a ball, we should see a ball in that frame. Okay? There's no motion in there for any object in the universe. And what the universal movie is, all objects in the universe, all atoms, anything that exists in the universe at a given distance with respect to all other atoms. Okay, so you have all atoms in the universe, at a given distance from all others. That's what it is, in a single frame. In the next frame, everyone moves to a new location and so on. So if I move my hand, I'm sure that here you can make this film strip of my hand moving up and down. It takes gazillions of frames in God's movie. And we're just going to chop one of those where absolutely nothing moves. And that's what becomes a single frame in a universal movie. And that's when these people start trembling, because they're going to talk about ether and vibrations of the ether and disturbances and who knows what vortices, and they can't talk about that in a single frame of the universal movie. In a single frame, you got to identify the object. You got to tell me what the ether is. If there's a vortex, we're going to stop the vortex. We're going to take a picture of the vortex. I need to know what a vortex is. A vortex of what? What is vorticing? That's what I need to find out. And these people say, well, you have this tornado there, this whirlwind. We take a snapshot of the tornado, and what we have is air. Okay? Nothing's moving. And so we don't have tornado in a single frame of the film. What we have in a single frame is air. You want to see wind, you want to see tornado, hurricane, any of those, you need to see at least 2 frames of the universal movie, or maybe more. Then you can see the tornado, you can see the vortex, or whatever nonsense these people come up with. In a single frame, there is no vortex. You need to tell me what physical object comprises the vortex. Like you have a vortex of water running down the drain. I take a snapshot of that. What I have is a water. That's it. That's what I have. That's objectively what I have. And there's no motion in that film. You say, well, but it's turning around. It's curved. Yeah, it's curved. It's curved water. We have no vortex. I don't see any motion in the photograph. You want to see motion? I need to see more than 1 frame of that film. Okay? And that's why these people have, their runaway minds. They move all over the place and they never stand still. We have to make them stand still in order to identify the objects in their theory. And so fellow tells me that the ether is made of motion. And another one says, what region inside the ether? It's disturbed. So again, they look at a piece of the ether, right? They can't tell you what the ether is. They say it's infinite, made of a single piece, and suddenly you have all this motion within the ether because they say it's a fluid. What do you mean it's a fluid? Yeah, it's a fluid made out of a single piece, a whole shebang. And so suddenly they take a piece of the ether, a region, then don't call it the ether. The ether was the whole shebang. If you're going to talk about a piece of the ether, don't call it the ether. Don't tell me the ether moved. The ether cannot move because it's the whole thing. Where's it going to move? With respect to what? Okay, so either you talk about the ether or you talk about a piece of the ether. And if you talk about a piece of the ether, you're talking about an ether made of parts. And there goes your whole assumption, your whole hypothesis down the drain, because you just told us it has no parts. So this is the issue. The issue is all these things have to be ironed out before you can give a presentation. Okay. Now here, what I do here is show what I call kindergarten physics for aetherists. Okay. So this is what physics is about. This is what you got to do. Okay. If you're an aetherist and you want to learn a little bit the basics of physics, here it is. We'll give you some kindergarten physics. Here it is. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, we're saying these are the ground rules, you can say, of physics. Physics is all about language. So there's no such thing as semantics, word salad, metaphysics, ontology, any of that thing. Physics, you have to define your terms. You better tell us what the words mean, especially the word object and the word exist. Those 2 words you cannot live without in physics. You can't do physics without objects. And we're talking about objects that exist out there in the universe because you're going to explain, a real phenomenon. So you can't live without these 2 words. And it turns out that in the last 10,000 years, no one defined these 2 words, object and exist. So this is what's so interesting about it, because we had mathematicians do this throughout history. And so instead of defining things qualitatively, they did everything quantitatively, thinking that they're going to figure out how this universe works through equations and numbers. And that's irrational, totally irrational. No, you will not figure out how this universe works through numbers and equations. If you want to know how the universe works, you got to give a qualitative explanation. Okay, so physics is the science of existence. So you do need to know what exist means, and you can't do physics without objects, so you need object and exist. You need to know what those 2 words mean, and you have to point to the objects. And these people avoid both. When you ask them to put the ether, they say it's not an object. I can't draw it because it's not an object. Okay, so they already failed that one. And then they talk about what exists, and they haven't defined exists, and that's when they say, oh, you're doing word salad. You're doing semantics. Okay, so anyways, you cannot make an assumption. You cannot prove or through an experiment determine what exists out there if it's invisible and intangible. So if there are mediators of light and gravity and they're invisible and intangible, you will not detect them through any kind of experiment. So please don't go to the lab, don't go to the field and say, I'm going to run an experiment to prove, what the gravity is or what light is. It's an irrational thing to do. The only way is through visualization. You got to stay in your room, do some armchair physics. You got to think. Take some pills if you need to, and you have to visualize what could be out there that's causing gravity and light, that kind of thing, okay? And what they have today is action at a distance, black magic, witchcraft, that's what the mathematicians do, they have, entanglement, and they say, oh yeah, entanglement, what is that? Well, that's this particle affects that one over there without a mediator. And gravity. Well, gravity again, action at a distance. Mass affects mass with nothing in between them. Why? Because they can't see or touch the mediator. And those are the two irrational criteria to define the word object. A mediator is not that which you can see or touch. A mediator is that which has shape. A thing, an object, a mediator, a substance, that which has shape. In physics, we don't care what it is in ordinary speech. In physics, that which has shape. It can have shape, doesn't mean you can see or touch it. And that's the bottom line. So this is what's hampered all these people throughout history. The fact that they wanted to see or touch the mediator, and when they could, they say, well, that's philosophy. They dismissed it as philosophy. Okay, another fellow, I don't think he's an aetherist, okay, but he came up and he said, look at a video that he put a link there for me to see. And again, I have some criticism about, what that video shows. Shows a lot of what's wrong in physics and so in people who get involved in the physical world. And this is what the fellow showed. He says, look, we have a light and it shines inside a container that has smoke, and that's the bottom left there. And you can see what he does. He vacuums out the smoke, and gradually you can see the light disappears as you move from left to right. So as you get to the right, you don't see the light. And so that's what he did, and then he tried to draw some conclusions from this experiment. And there were a lot of problems already with what he was saying. He talks about visually experiencing. That's got to do with observation. In science, we do not observe. We do not have anything called observation. It's not a step in the scientific method. It's a step in the mathematical method, not in science, okay, not in physics. And immediately he talks about the presence, the existence of something, of an object he calls smoke, okay? But we don't know yet what he means by exist. He just talks about the presence, but we'll concede that it means physical presence, meaning an object that has location. We're going to make that assumption. He says the cause. What is the cause? He says the voltage, one of the causes. Absolutely not. Voltage is a concept. You cannot use it as a thing. You cannot say voltage is a thing. You need to tell us what voltage is, what causes voltage. Voltage is a phenomenon. And you have to tell us what causes voltage. Why is there a positive or negative, or what is it? Tell us what voltage is. You can't say voltage is the cause of anything. Okay, that's a concept. Concepts cannot cause anything in physics. Okay, and so if you're going to give an explanation, please don't use concepts. So he says, okay, visually experience what? The presence of smoke. Okay, yeah, we don't visually experience nothing. Okay, we don't observe. We kill the observer. That's what we do in science. And what we're trying to figure out is what's the mediator of light. And if it's invisible, I don't know how he's going to figure it out through an experiment, which is what he's trying to do here. And so we have a problem because he's got this whole thing set up wrong. He's trying to do an experiment to tell us what light is. And he's going to conclude, obviously, he's going to have this irrational conclusion that light is not a thing, that there is no thing there. And, well, we'll see how he comes about. He says the following. He says, again, this is another piece of that video. I just took little pieces of it. He said, this is what is actually observed. Again, he's talking about witnesses, and can be proved. No, we don't prove anything in science. Okay, proof has to do with belief, with opinion, with religion. So never use the word proof or fact or truth in physics, okay, or in science. It's opinion. That's all it is. The other thing is we murdered a witness. We never say that observe. We never use the word observe in physics because it's got to do with opinion, with witnessing, with providing testimony. And so we do the Al Capone way. You know, we have the mafia principle of science. Kill the observer. We murder the observer. We murder the witness. We do not allow anyone to testify in physics, okay? And so these people want to testify. They say, this is what I observed. That's why we remove eyes. He put two eyes there, observation. No, we remove the eyes. Everybody's blind in physics, okay? Everybody is blind. We don't use eyesight. We don't use hands. We want an explanation, and we don't say, this is what I observed. Never, not in physics. Okay? And he says, I see the light. Observation again. He's introducing observation everywhere he can. And of course, because of that, he arrives at the irrational conclusions. These are his conclusions, the fellow who did the video, right? And says the following, light is not a physical entity. In other words, the mediator of light. That's what he's talking about. And again, he talks about observation, the sensation we experience. That's testimony. We don't have any use for that in physics. So again, we bring good old Al Capone. We wipe out all witnesses. Okay? We do not allow any of these people to testify. Now, this person, he said, he showed us some smoke there. He said, the reason we see the light is that the smoke sends somehow the light to your eyes, okay? And so he says the smoke is the mediator, it's the cause of light. So let's remove the smoke. And so here we have a situation. We have two astronauts, and they're between two galaxies where there's no smoke, no atoms practically between two galaxies, okay? And one shines a flashlight at the other astronaut. Okay, so this is the situation. We have two astronauts. They're in the middle of two galaxies. They're in the middle of nowhere, hardly any matter in where they're at. And one of them shines a flashlight at the other, and what he receives is a reflection of every atom in that astronaut's body that comes to his eye. Okay, so what happens is he's receiving, first he's sending, we'll call it sending, it's not sending at all. What it is that every atom in the white astronaut's body is connected to the flashlight. Okay, there's a mediator, okay, there. And so you just turn that mediator on and shines at a higher frequency. And because of the higher frequency, suddenly the astronaut lights up, and that every atom is now relaying that back to the astronaut who's got the flashlight, and he can see the white astronaut because of that. Because all the frequencies, all the wavelengths, actually link lengths, are relayed back to his eye. So it goes from the flashlight to every atom in the astronaut, and from the astronaut back to the original astronaut's eye. That's what's happening. And there you have no smoke, no environment for him to say, oh, it's the smoke that does it. No, here's no smoke, and we still can see that astronaut. Okay, so yeah, the issue is that his conclusion that light is not mediated by any physical entity, that's irrational. He hasn't shown that, or what he says proved. No, he hasn't proved that. What you have to do is understand what's happening. And what's happening is every atom in the universe is physically connected to every other atom in the universe. So when I have my flashlight, turn it on, what I'm doing is all those connections suddenly start vibrating at a higher frequency, and then it reaches your body, and every atom in your body is now relaying that same signal at a higher frequency back to my eye. That's how it works. So all atoms in my eye are connected to every atom in his body, and every atom in the flashlight is connected to every atom in his body. So what we have is relay. Just there's no bouncing, okay? It's just higher frequency and higher frequency back to my eye. That's why I can see them. That's the explanation. That is a rational explanation. Whether you believe it or not, that's a separate issue. Okay, so what is physics about? What are these aetherists into? They should be learning at least the basics. And here it is. Physics is the science of existence. Physics only studies or tries to figure out what exists out there. Okay? The first job of a physicist is to figure out what exists. Okay? So that's the first job. That is their job. Okay? And that means you identify the objects, the mediators, the things, whatever you want to call them. Okay? Some object there, right? And that make the universe work the way it does. Okay? And then the second task is determining how the mechanism works. And for that, you need first to define, the language, so that we understand your language. We need to know what you mean by exist, by move, by motion, by distance. A lot of words, right? And you're going to explain a mechanism. That's what we want. We want a mechanism. What is the mechanism? How does the universe work? Meaning, why does it work the way it does? That's what we're trying to figure out, right? And those are some examples there that we want to understand: gravity, light, workings of the atom, etc., magnetism. So that's in a nutshell what physics is about. And these are the foundations. These are the words you cannot do without in physics. You need to define these words if you're going to give a physical interpretation, which is everything that physics is about. Nothing but this. And you need to know what an object is, what space is. You need to define what space, that gives us this background. We see the moon. Why? Because there's a black stuff out there that's behind the moon, and we need to find out what that black stuff is. We call it space. We need to know what that space is. Is it a physical object? Is it an abstract concept? What is space? And no one has been able to define that in the last 10,000 years. We need to define the word distance, location, set of distances. Distance, just separation, qualitative separation, not what it means in mathematics. Mathematics, they start pulling out the measuring rod and say, well, it's 10 feet. No, that's not distance. That's distance traveled by the end of your measuring tape. In physics, there's only separation. That's it. That's all Mother Nature recognizes. Mother Nature doesn't unroll any measuring tape. She doesn't know what a meter is. She doesn't know what a foot is. None of that. Motion, two or more locations of an object. Once you have one location, the object moves to a second location. Now you have motion. Exists, if it's an object that has location in the universe, has a distance with respect to every atom in the universe, that object exists by definition, not because you believe or stop believing. You want God to exist? Very simple. Don't believe in God. Don't stop believing in God. Don't ask, does God really exist or not? No, none of those are valid. All of those are irrational statements. God exists if God is a physical object and has location, has distance with respect to every atom in the universe. Then God exists by definition, not because you believe. And then a concept, a word that invokes or embodies two objects. Okay? And those are the words you need to do physics. You can't do physics without these words, because those words will constantly pop up in your dissertation. If you're going to try to explain a physical mechanism, you absolutely need to define those words.